This is Mrs. O'Neill for AP Chemistry, Chapter 1, Section 3, Properties of Matter. The first thing you should have done was watch Mr. Anderson's introductory video on chemical change evidence. You should have taken some notes. These are mine. The first thing he mentioned was how you lose mass overnight, and I thought it was interesting how you lose a half a pound of mass on average every night. And how do you do this? One way is physically through the evaporation of water, and one way is chemically, like cellular respiration, and that would be a chemical change as well. He did this nice little flow chart. Hopefully you understand that. And then he really talked about the evidence of change. And there were 5 different ways of evidence that a chemical change has occurred. And he talked only about one way a physical evidence change has occurred, but there are others. So you should have paused the video at this point and then checked your answer and go through each one of these and classify it as a chemical change or as a physical change. So those are the answers that you should have gotten. He also talked about how in lab you will be measuring these chemical changes. One way is going to be acid-base, and that's through chemical change. Precipitate, and he talked about how double replacement reactions, and you're going to figure out what is the compound that is formed through this precipitate, and redox reactions through titrations as well. So now you should have your notes packet out. And again, when I get through the notes, you may want to pause the video, fill in the blanks, and then start the video up again to hear my words. So your objective is going to be able to sort these characteristics using properties and then be able to identify and separate substances. So properties, physical are just characteristics. That's what we want to remember. If we're talking about a physical property, we're just talking about the characteristics of property. If we're talking about the chemical property, we're talking about how it reacts with other material. There are intensive and extensive properties. So to know the difference, this is a nice little Venn diagram where it talks about the examples of extensive, talks about the examples of intensive, and things that would be both. So this is a nice flow chart that talks about the properties of matter and would we classify those properties of matter of chemical or physical, and you would go through this flow chart and answer those questions. So again, you might want to pause the video and go through that. So in your notes packet, physical change versus a chemical change. Now a physical change, all you're changing is the appearance of that piece of matter. Where a chemical change, you're forming a new substance, and that's why we call this also a chemical reaction. So if we look at these examples of physical changes, melting of ice cream, slicing of bread, painting of walls, what would be the evidence that it's the physical change? So again, pause the video, answer the question, and then check your answers. Shape would change for melting of ice. Size would change for slicing of the bread, and painting of walls, or the color would be that evidence. So if we look at the chemical changes here, we have a lot more options to choose from. So again, pause the video, see if you can come up with the clue, or like I like to say, what is the evidence of each of these? So for the bread dough baking, color change. Eggs rotting, the smell changes. The wood burning, of course, we've created new matter. We could talk about gas evolution. We could talk about the heat. We could talk about the light. Baking soda, again, gas created because of those bubbles. Fireworks, heat and light is created. So sometimes, especially with a chemical change, there's more than one evidence that could be a possibility. Haha, hopefully you like that. So separation of mixtures, they talked about 3 different ways to separate mixtures in your textbook: filtration, distillation, and chromatography. So here's an example of filtration, like you're making coffee or you're separating a solid and a liquid. Distillation is more in organic chemistry, where you're going to take a flask, a mixture of all different kinds of stuff, and what happens is you boil it off, and at different temperatures, every substance has their own melting point or evaporation point. And what happens, it goes through this condenser and then it liquefies. So you go from a liquid to a gas, make it go through a condenser, go through the cold water, the gas then turns back into a liquid. And what happens is you can get that pure substance. And you would do this at different temperatures and you would collect different materials. And chromatography, you might have done a paper chromatography either in your physical science class or in Chem 1 class. This is like forensics, and this is a gas chromatographer that, again, collects different materials at different times. So if you have any questions, I will gladly answer them in class.